this in our book group.
You did?
Yeah,
Oh, I remember.
yeah.
And Roger was there.
Right, right. Well, I haven't been to one of these for a long time. It'll be interesting to see what people make of it.
It's a good group. You should keep going.
It's just that you have to read the books.
Yes, yes, you do.
I bury myself in books, as
Yes.
we all do.
Yeah. All of us people who tend towards books, yes.
Right,
Yeah,
it's not a bad thing.
it's definitely not. It's definitely not.
You know, it just reminds me, I have a cousin who I'm not particularly close with, but she likes to read books. She's a year younger than me, we're the same age. You know,
Yeah,
so-
yeah.
And so she, about 3-4 months ago, she asked me if there are any books I could recommend. She had given me like 5 books.
Okay.
I said, I'm a member of 3 groups, and I read a lot. Well, what kind of books do you like? I said. She said, well, I like books that will make me cry.
Well, that's
I
kind
said,
of lovely.
okay, so I gave her Foster.
Yeah.
And
Did
she
you read that? Foster.
No,
She
Good.
called me back. It's like 90 pages.
It's beautiful,
very short.
beautiful.
who is it?
It's by
Claire.
Claire Keegan,
Okay.
an Irish author.
Huh,
It doesn't have any Jewish
right, well, I haven't
relevance,
heard
but,
of it.
so she writes me a letter. She said, I couldn't call you, I would cry on the phone.
Well, good. That's kind of a nice definition, books that make me cry. Kind of, I like those. Well, I just started, Adrian and I were in a group, and I just started Lord Jim, which I'm liking it at the beginning.
Hello, hi.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Have you signed the constitutional amendment petition? Are you for reproductive rights in Ohio? Be careful of what you say.
I would think so.
Seriously outnumbered.
Yeah.
Seriously, have you signed a petition?
I have not.
Oh, we got one.
Please, if you don't mind. Sure. You can read this if you wish.
I'm going to take your word for it.
Basically,
That's what I said.
it's to get this on the ballot.
What dumb is that?
We need 150
Hello.
signatures.
How many do you think they have so far?
Hello. Hi. Did you ever find a new place to live?
The real
No, I'm still working on it. Have you got one for me?
difficulty is they have to get a certain number.
Well, there should be more available now, right?
26.
There's always something available. When I decide that that's really what I want to do, I just have to do it.
Yeah.
And then it'll get done. But
Yeah.
until then, I'm spending
Of course.
usual kind of thing. I'm not unhappy where I am. I have a lot of friends.
It's just a distance from where you
It's
live.
So that's it, huh?
If we were 10 miles closer, it'd be so much easier.
Adrian, there's only one petition.
It's not bad.
going
It's
out,
not
right,
bad.
or soon. And I don't know. because
Yes.
I don't know.
Please, it's
Oh,
different.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, right, right, yeah, yeah.
This is for,
Okay, yeah,
oh,
right.
But there
yeah,
are
it just came out.
How are you?
There's something about it.
Hey, Jamie.
Hey,
How are
I'm
you?
good. How are you?
Doing
It
good.
really wouldn't be that difficult.
Or fine.
sign this petition.
Whatever, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Let me ask
I'm feeling, there's this, I'm feeling good, I'm feeling
It's a
well.
petition.
And most people say, well,
Ballot
but it really should be,
for this November.
shouldn't it? Because feeling well is this, I'm feeling well. How?
And the
Yeah,
Constitution.
and I was always told, I would always say, feeling good, and then, no, it should be well, because you're feeling well.
But feeling's a state, but it's also an activity.
Right,
Make sure you.
yes,
And
right,
well means,
right, I can feel,
I'm doing that well.
Right.
You're out there.
There are these things. Hi, good morning, how are you?
I'm good, how are
Thank
you?
Good, thanks.
I'm thinking about what you're talking about.
I'm sorry?
I said I'm thinking about what you're talking about. I think either word works,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
Well,
I'm feeling well, I'm feeling good.
I think there are some distinctions that are a little too fussy,
Uh-huh.
you know?
You can sidestep
well,
the
it's
whole
like
problem.
you answer the phone, it's I,
Right.
is right, but do we really say
I
that?
don't know, I mean, we
It's
don't.
me.
Right,
She said.
You sidestep
That's
the whole
the
problem.
fussiness point.
Right. You say I'm doing well.
Are we live streaming?
we are.
Oh, good.
So,
That's why no one's here.
yeah, another group before will not be
Yeah,
here.
but I just moved this one.
Either of them are feeling
Yeah.
much at
I've
home.
got plenty of room.
You could,
Unless the
yeah,
crowd
Feeling
shows
well.
up.
and this is mine, not that I need it.
Your deal, so.
Have you read the book?
Yep, I read the book
Have you?
3 times.
3 times.
I have too.
I read it twice.
It's a great book, isn't it?
It's a great,
So beautifully written.
You know, isn't it like PowerPoint? There are all these stories going on at the same time.
Yeah, I love that.
The Odyssey in the students, the Odyssey in his father, the Odyssey of him as a teacher. It's just so dense.
And he weaves them all together.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Not easy thing, I think.
Well, hello, people who are watching us over live stream. Hello, Ruth. Hello, Aura. Hope you're feeling this. Hope you feel better soon. I'll use the microphone for
Oh,
me.
good.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone watching us on live stream. Welcome to the Temple Book Group. We miss you, Ruth and Aura, who are not able to join us today. And we're lucky to have Rabbi Roger Klein, who's going to talk about Daniel Mendelssohn's amazing memoir, An Odyssey, a Father, a Son, and an Epic. Just as a reminder, next month we are reading The Escape Artist by Jonathan Friedland. I do have a couple of copies available, and that'll be on June 14th. And yes, and then I just made a deal with Lynn. In July, we're going to read The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton, which should be really interesting. And I have this printed out that the author of that is going to be speaking at the Hudson Library tomorrow evening, which you can watch over live stream as well.
Yeah, it's virtual, it's not live.
Oh, it's
just
virtual, yeah.
So you just tune in at 7
Yeah.
o'clock.
I can pass this around a little bit later if you want. And that's it. Thank you and welcome and enjoy.
By the way, she tricked me into that.
I
She did,
Yeah.
right. It's just like her, right?
Yeah.
Would you like the door closed at all?
I'll close it, yeah.
Okay, someone is coming, but.
I think if you close it though, people might think that it's a little too
Yeah.
formidable to come in.
That's true.
You could close one of the doors, but I wouldn't close them both.
Candy.
Hi. Hi, Candy.
I hope I'm not late.
No, so glad you're here.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, great,
You
good.
look good.
Thank you.
I like those glasses. Are they new?
No, they're old. They're old. I have to get the lenses changed.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. So glad to be here with you, and those who are live streaming, glad to have you as well. One of the things those of us who have spent time teaching know that there's no better way to learn than to teach. To take a topic or a book and commit yourself to talking about it. And that is real learning. You know, one of my favorite definitions about poetry is about blank verse. That blank verse is the process of weaving the basket while you're putting the fruit into it. And I think that's a good metaphor for how at least I go about preparing something. I'm reading the book. I've read the book now several times, love the book, as I'm sure you do too. And as I'm reading it and gathering items to talk about, I'm also asking myself, how can I shape these items? And it goes back and forth. You gather the material and you think provisionally about how they go together, and then that informs how you gather more material, and pretty soon you've got some view of the whole, of which the parts are elements. And that's what I've tried to do, and it's a lovely challenge and a lovely endeavor. I'm not sure that everybody around the table knows each other, so why don't we just go around the table and give our names, and then we can talk to one another by our name. Claudia, you want to start?
Claudia. I think I know. Jane.
Poetry. I recognize
Yeah, yeah.
Adrian.
Jane.
Lynn.
I'm sorry, you are
I'm Lynn.
Lynn?
Lynn from Hudson.
Ellen.
Judy from Solon.
Candy.
I'm
Mayfield
also,
Heights.
Everywhere.
and I'm also Jane.
see, here comes Jackie coming down here. Big, what I want to do together is for me to give some sense, at least as I understand it, of the structure of the book and its overall contents. Then I want to focus on one particular element of the book, at one of the odysseys in the book. So the title of this book is An Odyssey, a Father, a Son, and an Epic. Okay, so it's quite clear to those who have read the book that it tells many stories at the same time. So we have fathers. We have Odysseus, and we have J. Mendelssohn, the author's father. We have sons. We have Telemachus, and we have Dan Mendelssohn. It turns out that at the end of the book, the Odyssey and this book, that Odysseus is a father as well as a son, the son of Laertes. We have here a father, a son, and we have an epic. An epic is, and I'm reading a definition, a long poem, typically one derived from ancient oral tradition, narrating the deeds and the adventures of heroic and or legendary figures or the history of a nation. So I think the key word in this title, at least the one that interests me the most, is the idea of epic. And there are several epics that are at work in this book, several long adventures. There's the Odyssey itself, which is the subject matter of a class that Dan Mendelssohn taught. There is the epic, the long journey of J. Mendelssohn and his son Dan. And the book toggles back and forth between these two parallel adventures. So if you have your book, I'm going to be reading from several passages. I hope we have the same paginations. At the bottom of page 5. And so a few weeks later, in June, fresh from our recent immersion in the text of the Homeric epic, this is Dan writing about himself and his father,
We have
took the cruise.
We do, it's the same, look at the very bottom. Very bottom.
Bottom of
Very
page
bottom,
5.
it's like the last sentence.
Very last line, let me go back to it again. And so a few weeks later, in June, fresh from our recent immersion in the text of the Homeric epic, we took the cruise, which lasted 10 days in all, one day for each year of Odysseus's long journey home. And then I think that nicely describes it, that there is the journey in the classroom, there is the actual journey that they take, and Dan Mendelssohn does show, by a kind of parallelism here, how the two are interwoven. The journey lasted 10 days, one day for each of Odysseus's long journey. So it's quite clear that this book works on a variety of levels. It's about the Homeric epic, its great, stunning, creative adventures. It also contains insights from both the book and from the classroom experience into the human condition. It also is a book about the mastery of a particular teacher. I think as we see Dan Mendelssohn handling his classroom discussions, he is able to both guide and to listen, to lead the class in certain directions, but to be open to their own understanding of things. At one point there's a crisis where the students think that he is leading them with too heavy a hand, and he backs off a little bit, is embarrassed about it, but also recognizes the role of the teacher. While the teacher who is nurturing the student's capacity for insight and for discovery. Of course, it is about fathers and sons. And just as a kind of interesting illustration of this, there is in Greek the word polytropos, which evidently means a person of many twists and turns. And that, of course, is how Odysseus is described in the proem at the beginning of the Odyssey. But I think that it's also clearly about J. Mendelssohn as well. So the parallels are many. An additional one is the search of sons for their fathers. Of course, the very structure of the Odyssey begins with the telemichai. Is that right? No, how does it pronounce?
Telemachia.
Telemachia.
I believe so.
The first 4 books of the Odyssey, we don't meet Odysseus at all. This features Telemachus, his son, searching for him, and Dan, of course, is searching for his father. What is the Odyssey all about, we might ask? Well, it's about adventures. It's about the interconnection of human beings and the gods, but it's also about self-discovery and the discovery of others. It seems to me that the book's most important question, to which the author comes back over and over again, is who are we really? What does it mean to know oneself and to know another? And so beyond all the adventures of life that we negotiate, our relationships, our work, our activities, our memories, who are we really? And one of the Odyssey's core themes is the theme of disguise and recognition. Playing certain roles, thinking of oneself in certain roles, and the question of who fundamentally, at our core, are we. And so it seems to me that this theme is also relevant to questions that we ask ourselves in the modern world. It's a book about, or focuses on, psychology. Who do we think of ourselves and how do we understand others? So it makes the book, I think, a particularly modern take on questions that we ask ourselves. I can't help but digress just for a moment about one of my favorite terms in the history of modern philosophy, and that is the 2-word phrase, referential opacity. There's a very famous philosopher, some of you may have heard of him, taught at Harvard for many years, Willard Van Orman Quine. And Quine was a person who was very interested in language and how language converges on the world. And his basic point about referential opacity is that we think when we look around at objects that we see them as they are. But just take this table. I see this table in a different way depending on the quality of light in a room, whether it's dark, whether it's light, and so on. So Quine's point here is that the things that we refer to, objects in our world, are to some degree opaque to us. We don't really fully get to them. We only see them how they appear to us in different ways. And then Quine makes the following interesting move. We are opaque even to ourselves. So as we think about who am I, or by extension, who are you? Who are you to me? It's more difficult than it might seem to get across to the other side, to really discover the object that we're intending to refer to. It's important, I think, to note, and Dan Mendelssohn makes a point out of this, that the word Odysseus, the name Odysseus, comes from the Greek word that means pain. And if the Odyssey is about journeys, then it's clear from the etymology that this journey of Odysseus, that this journey of Dan Mendelsohn with his father is going to be filled not only with recognition and insight, but also with pain. So let's take a look at the very first paragraph to set the scene. One January evening a few years ago, just before the beginning of the spring term, in which I was going to be teaching an undergraduate seminar on the Odyssey, my father, a retired research scientist who was then aged 81, asked me, for reasons I thought I understood at the time, if he might sit in on the course. And I said yes. Once a week for the next 16 weeks, he would make the trip between the house in the Long Island suburbs where I grew up, a modest split level in which he still lived with my mother, to the Riverside campus of the small college where I teach, which is called Bard. At 10:10 each Friday morning, he would take a seat among the freshmen who were enrolled in the course, 17 or 18-year-olds, not even a quarter his age, and join in the discussion of this old poem, an epic about long journeys and long marriages and what it means to yearn for home. A lovely and I think rich first paragraph. So the book, one of the book's main themes, of course, is the search of the son for the father. Telemachus for Odysseus, Dan for his father. Dan is looking for his distracted father, and he's always trying to figure him out. He is both known and unknown to the son. Who is J. Mendelsohn? What does he know about him? Page 19. Four or five lines up from the bottom. I have no memory of what my father did during all those days at the hospital. Even when his father, he's visiting his own father, was well, I knew, even when his own father was well, I knew they didn't talk much. The point, I somehow understood, was that Daddy was there, that he had come. Your father is your father, he told me a decade later when Poppy was really dying this time in a hospital near our house on Long Island. Many of my father's pronouncements took this X is X form, always with the implication that to think otherwise, to admit that X could be anything other than X, was to abandon the strict codes, emphasis on strict codes, that governed his thinking and held the world in place. Excellence is excellence, period, or smart is smart. There's no such thing as being a bad test taker. Your father is your father. So, J. Mendelsohn is something of a rigid individual who knows something about reality. Other examples of this, what we might call hardness about his father. A rhyme is a rhyme. You can't approximate. Only science is science. This was a response to Dan's discussion of philology, the study of language and writing. Only science is science. A crime is a crime. If you've done wrong, you've done wrong. There are no gradations. This is J. Mendelsohn. His voice, Dan comes in to parenthetically say, his voice soured on the word gradations. And I knew what he was thinking. Moral gradations were like sloppy arithmetic, that it was a contradiction in terms. There are no gradations in breaking the law. It's either not broken or it's broken. That's what justice is. So this is a discussion about why a certain one of the suitors who are after Penelope They want to think about letting him escape the palace because he's been the kindest of all. No, don't let him escape. It's just for him to go down with all the others, because a crime is a crime, and it doesn't matter what your attitude is. Look on page 128. The end of 3 lines down. That rigorous code, which allowed for no gray areas, in which X was always and only X. Marriage was marriage. Your wife was your wife. No matter how strained things could be, no matter how many times you stalked off after dinner to seek refuge in your little bedroom while she cleaned up the kitchen, weeping. Okay? So these are the things he has known about his father. Other comments, I think, richly described. It is impossible to see the world clearly, Jay says, if you don't know calculus. For him, the more difficult something was to achieve or to appreciate, the more unpleasant to do or to understand, the more likely it was to possess this quality that for him was the hallmark of worthiness. Jay, Dan goes on to say, loathed exaggeration. Page 29. Long voyages, no fuss, second paragraph on 29. Many years have passed since our long and circuitous return home, and during those years, I myself have traveled on planes with small children, which is why when I now think back on my father's story, 2 things strike me. The first is that it is really a story about how good my father was, how well he had handled it all, I think now. Downplaying the situation, pretending there was nothing unusual, setting an example by sitting quietly by himself, and resisting as I myself would not have done, since in many ways I am indeed more my mother's child and grandpa's grandchild, the impulse to sensationalize or complain. The second thing I'm struck by when I think about how this story now is that in all the time we had together on the plane, it never occurred to either one of us to talk to the other. We were happy to have our books. So this is the J. Mendelsohn that Dan has known as he was growing up. But, let's see here. Let's look on page 77 about Jay in Dan's seminar. So I'm about halfway down into that page, end of a line. You see the italicized word gefilte, as in gefilte fish, and I'm continuing from there. It was easy to imagine her, his mother, with her brisk cheer and wild sense of humor, her talent for making striking and imaginative holiday decorations, her theatrical manner and high imagination, as a terrific teacher for very young children. But when it came to my father, I drew a blank. I thought of how he'd looked at the math quizzes and tests I brought home, the scrawled red X's like angry embroidery along the side of the paper, and I had to wonder what kind of teacher Professor J. Mendelsohn, you remember that sign on his door at home, what kind of teacher Professor J. Mendelsohn had been. Now he was sitting in my classroom on the first day of the Odyssey class with his hand in the air. Yes, he said, I'm his father. Unlike my mother, my father didn't enjoy being the center of attention. Whenever he found himself on the spot, whenever he was the only speaker in a room full of people, he'd stress random words as he spoke, as if these random emphases would lend his speech authority. I'm taking Dan's course, he was saying now. A couple of the students looked amused when they heard him call me by my first name, because I thought I'd try to read the classics again, which I haven't read since high school. That was during World War II in the 1940s. His lips tightened into a private smile. Many of your parents probably weren't even born then. My father jerked his shiny head in my direction and said, "I knew all that stuff before he did." The students were giggling. Well, I knew a lot of it, and he went on after a moment, vaguely tapping his iPad onto which he downloaded the text of the Odyssey. I read Ovid, that was his pronunciation of Ovid. I read Ovid in Latin. I used to know the myths. I read the Iliad, the Odyssey, but it was only excerpts, so I thought, now I read the whole thing. A couple of students stared. They were loving this. My father said, I figured now was my chance to read it again before I died. Then he gestured toward me again, and his face assumed an expression. Eyes narrowed to slits, lips pinched tight, the corners of his mouth turned down, the narrow gleaming head faintly nodding as he spoke, as if reassuring himself of the truth of what he was saying or hearing. That might strike someone who didn't know him as humorous, but I knew him. If that guy is a classicist, that guy meaning Dan, if that guy is a classicist, he said, jabbing a pale white finger at me, it's because he gets it from me. And then a paragraph or two later, Dan repeats this, he gets it from me. So this is the crusty, irascible, self-confident, overbearing father that Dan knows. Let's just look at page 65. So about 8 lines, 9 lines down, beginning of a paragraph, Trisha's curls. See it? Trisha's curls bobbled as she wrote in her notebook. Looking up at me, she said, I think the first book is meant to be a kind of surprise, first book of the Odyssey. So here we are at the beginning of this big epic about this great hero, and the first reference to him is that he's a kind of loser. He's a castaway, he's a prisoner, he has no power and no way of getting home. He's hidden from everything he cares for. So it's as if he can't go any lower. It can only go uphill from here. Here he is with Calypso, right, for those first 7 years. Great, I said. Yes, it provides a baseline for the hero's narrative arc. It was at this point that my father raised his head and said, hero? I don't think he's a hero at all. In unison, the students' heads swiveled in his direction. Remember, he's sitting off the side and not at the main table. Instead of sitting with the rest of the students at the seminar table, he'd taken a seat in the corner of a room off to my left, and a little behind me at my 8 o'clock, in a blocky wooden chair beneath a window that looked out onto a depressing expanse of gravelly plowed snow. He would sit in this same chair every Friday for the next 15 weeks. I'll tell you what I think is interesting about Odysseus. I turned and stared at him. When we first talked about the possibility of his sitting in on my course, he promised me that he wasn't going to talk in class. Turn the page, second paragraph. Now, on the first day of the class, he was talking. I'll tell you what I think is interesting, he repeated, skipping down near the bottom. Okay, I was saying to my father, now, what do you think is so interesting? Why don't you think he's a hero? My father cleared his throat and motioned to Tricia. First, I agree with her that he's a loser, but not only because he's a helpless prisoner. The students looked amused. Am I the only one, and this is the beginning of a query that appears throughout the book, am I the only one, my father went on, who's bothered by the fact that Odysseus is alone when the poem begins? What do you mean, alone? And now I'm skipping down to the paragraph. My father's voice was loud. That's hundreds of men, he says. So my question is, what happened to the 12 ships and their crews? Why is he the only person coming home alive? Skipping again near the bottom. My father made a face as if he could have done better than Odysseus. Could have brought the 12 ships and their crews home safely. He said, so you admit that he's lost all his men? Yep, I said a little defiantly. I felt that I was 11 years old again. And Odysseus was a naughty schoolmate whom I decided I was going to stand by even if it meant being punished, punished along with him. He was clearly not convinced. Next page, 68, about halfway, beginning again, my father said, well, I don't think he's such a great hero. He looked around the table. What kind of leader loses all his men? You call that a hero? The students laughed out loud. Then, as if fearful that they'd overstepped some boundary, they peered inquisitively down the length of the seminar table at me. Since I wanted to show them I was a good sport, I smiled broadly. But what I was thinking was, this is going to be a nightmare. So I think Dan sets up the situation very nicely. So now I want to turn to what I'm going to call the great recognition scenes and just see how they unfold. First of all, on page 146, what I'm calling the foreshadowing of two really great and substantial recognition scenes. And now they are on the cruise. So, let's see here. My father, middle of the page on 146. My father looked around. Obviously, it's interesting. There they are looking at sights, he said. But his voice trailed off and he shook his head. But what? I was curious. He looked at me and then, to my surprise, threw an arm around my shoulders and patted me, smiling crookedly. But the poem feels more real than the ruins, Dan. And here I think we see the beginning of a turn toward a softening of the father and a recognition of the quality and the accomplishments of his son. Let's turn to page 162. So, where are we here? So we are now in the, let's see now. Okay. So they're about to go now to visit Calypso's cave. Okay? So after the space near the top of the page. The only time my father didn't cap off an evening aboard the cruise ship by saying, the poem feels more real, was after we'd gone to Gozo off Malta to see Calypso's cave. This, in fact, was where we were heading on the night my father hummed along and sang, Over the Rainbow. We'd been warned the day before that the descent into the cave was rocky and difficult, and that only a few people at a time could go inside, given how cramped it was. Elderly people and people who had mobility issues were advised not to visit the site. When I heard this, I determined not to go. I suffered badly from claustrophobia and so on. The next paragraph. So there was no way I was going to go into Calypso's cave. What are you talking about? My father exclaimed when I told him, you have to go. 7/10 of the Odyssey takes place there. 7/10? I had no idea what he was talking about. It's 24 books long, I began. Math, Dan, math. Odysseus spends 10 years getting home, right? I nodded. And he spends 7 years with Calypso, right? I nodded again. So in theory, 7/10 of the Odyssey actually takes place there. You can't miss it. Well, I protested weakly, actually, no. The poem isn't actually equal to his life. They're two different things. But he wasn't convinced. You can't argue with numbers, he said. We got on the bus and went. As the big coach rattled and bumped along the rocky roads, it was touchingly clear that my father was trying to distract me. Look at those beautiful blue flowers, he would say, pointing. The windows were coated with road dust, and it was hard to see. Next paragraph. We pulled up at the site, and everyone got out of the bus. We were standing on the brow of a brown, lifeless hill. Scrub clung to the dun-colored dirt like scabs to diseased skin. A narrow stair descended steeply from where we were standing to an uneven rocky surface 15 feet below. Below, the face of the cave looked like a sheer wall of stone with a low, dark cleft in the middle. It was clear you'd have to stoop to get in. A few passengers had already made the descent and were disappearing into the cleft. The boy I'd seen on the first day, the one who declared that Homer needed an editor, and whom Dan J. admired for that, had just entered, along with a taller kid who must have been his brother. A clammy terror seized me. I shook my head. No, I said to my father, no, sorry, I'm not going. You go, you'll tell me what it's like. Oh, come on, Dan, my father said. I'll be with you, it'll be fine. I felt like I was 5 years old. I said again, no, you go. I'll stay up here. Then my father did something that astonished me. He reached over and took my hand. I looked at him and burst out laughing. Daddy. You'll be fine, he said, holding my hand lightly, a thing I couldn't remember him having done since I was a small boy. His own was light and dry and slender. I looked at it awkwardly. I'll be there with you every step of the way, my father was saying, and if you hate it, we'll leave. I looked down at our clasped hands and to my surprise found that it made me feel better. As I looked around to see if anyone was watching, I realized, with a complicated feeling of relief, that whoever did see us would assume that I was leading my father by the hand. I was leading my father by the hand. He, after all, was the one at real risk. He was the one who was terrified of falling. And then they go down into the cave, and he says after, "You okay, Dan?" I grinned shakily. I think this is one time when we could say that the poem doesn't feel more real, I said. "Ha," my father said. Then he looked at me and said, "You did good, Dan." That night in the lounge, people were talking about Calypso's cave, and so they talk about it a little bit. Middle of page 165, after he talks to the woman about his father holding his hand, some of the others glanced at her quizzically. "Survived?" someone asked. I was trying to think of something funny to say when my father cut in. "We had a great time," he said loudly. I looked over at him, but he was leaning forward, facing into the ragged semicircle of armchairs, like a teacher addressing a study group. "I didn't want to go," my father said to them. "The stairs are hard for me. I thought it would be too much for me physically. But Dan helped me, and I'm glad I went." After all, Odysseus spent 7/10 of his adventures there. He paused instead, not looking at me. It was one of the more impressive things I've actually seen. The pianist was playing the song he'd sung the night before. I didn't know what time it was. Daddy closed his eyes and started humming along. I didn't know what year it was. Life was no prize. Ksenia smiled. "Your father is a very charming man," she murmured. I think this is really, don't you agree, one of the powerful scenes in the book. What occasions it? Here was a guy who was very self-absorbed, knew what was right, treated his children and his wife badly without any sense of remorse. And all of a sudden, he comes to make room for his son and his son's need. I remember a comment that one commentator made on the famous biblical phrase, love your neighbor as yourself. And the comment was that this saying, this imperative, amounts to the recognition that somebody else exists. And this is what I think we find here, this capacity to broaden himself, to see that another person, that his son exists and is not just a person who orbits around him. So I've got more to say and to read, but I've been doing all the talking here. So before we return, what comments do you have about the book and what has impressed you?
Let me just make a brief comment about that last scene.
Yeah.
J. Mendelsohn never lied. In addition to everything else, never lied. He tells us this over and over again.
Yeah.
But he lied.
Yes, yeah, he lies
He
here.
lied.
Good point. Right. And what's paradoxical about it is he gets to a deeper truth through that lie, doesn't he? The existence of his son.
There's a similar passage, I think it's earlier in the book, when there's this question about why didn't he get his PhD finished? Why didn't he go to Bronx High School of Science? Why didn't he actually do the Aeneid and continue his Latin education? And he turns to his son at one, his son sort of asks, well, why didn't you go on and finish and take the Aeneid, do the Aeneid?
Say that again now, a little louder, please.
I'm sorry. Earlier on, well, there are many questions about why the father didn't finish his PhD, why he didn't go to Bronx High School of Science, why he didn't do various things. He was given the opportunity to continue his Latin and study the Aeneid. He didn't do it, felt badly afterwards. But at a certain point, he says to his son, "You'll do it for me."
Yeah.
And the son is very touched by the feeling that he is fulfilling what his father could not, for one reason or another, have done.
Right.
Was that loud enough?
No, that's a wonderful moment too. And actually, we find out at the end that the reasons his father gives for not going on were something of a lie.
They were lies.
Yeah.
That's what I was gonna say, the reason about not finishing the PhD.
Right.
Lied all those years.
And the implication is, I'm not sure it's ever stated explicitly, is that part of his developed sense of his toughness, of his hardness, in a way is a reaction to the softness which did not allow him really to pursue because of the vulnerability that he was feeling. So that the person that he was showing himself to be was a kind of defense against self-recognition. Other thoughts about what it is you felt in terms of in this book?
I have something I could say.
Yeah, please.
Throughout the book, I had read this years ago, and I didn't remember anything other than basically the title. I couldn't remember any of this particular facts. But as I'm reading it, I'm somewhat feeling sort of empathy for the father, because the son is in a way like rolling his eyes at him. And I thought, reading it before, I don't know how I felt, but I think before I would have felt more like Dan, my parents, they're just, they shouldn't really be here, whatever, if this were the case, and, this is like embarrassing, as he said. But as I'm reading it now, I'm sort of feeling a connection with the father. And when I got to almost the end, and I saw that he sat on the trains with the young students, and that they liked him, and they thought he was an interesting person, I actually started to cry, because I felt in a way like my children, they're good people, they are, but they don't necessarily see in me what people, maybe their friends, when I meet their friends and we have great conversations, and I can connect to him on that he sort of knew that Dan wasn't, you know, he knew how Dan was feeling, that he was in the class. He understood that the son wasn't totally happy about that, but he tolerated it. And then he realized at the end that his father was special, and he did have the ability to connect and to be empathetic and to be humorous, and that people weren't just putting up with him, but they enjoyed him. It was sort of opening his heart and his mind when he heard that. I was thinking, gosh, I hope my kids feel like that one day if they realize that their parent is an interesting person.
It's on the cruise ship, on the cruise as well. Everybody finds his father charming.
Right,
And he says, who, my father? Charming?
right.
So that was my takeaway this time, really, of the aha moment that the son got, and because that's sometimes difficult for young people, especially intelligent people. He was a professor, to realize that their parents were interesting people too. So anyways.
I was thinking about that too, and wondering, I think it's just so universal. I remember being embarrassed by my parents, and our kids are, I don't know that we embarrass them, but they're always, looking at each other, rolling their eyes. And what I'm wondering, is that like a developmental necessity that you have to distance yourselves from your parents in a sense, or, you know what I'm saying?
I think so.
Yeah, otherwise you
What
don't
did you
ever
say,
separate.
When we're younger, we see our parents as just our parents.
And so you can become a full person, because if you don't do that, then you stay enmeshed with them, and then you never really grow up and then leave them emotionally. So yeah, that's a good point.
And so, whose odyssey is this, really?
Everyone's, everyone.
It's both, yeah, it's
I mean,
And the thing is that,
everyone. It's Telemachus
Oh, sorry.
and Odysseus and Dan's father, Jay, and Dan, and,
the students.
yeah, probably everyone. I mean, we all have our odyssey. I've only read this once, and clearly it's not enough. But I probably won't read it again, because the run-on sentences drove me crazy. But I thought the father and the son were far more connected, even before this book began, than your excerpts are giving them credit for. And I say that because he allowed his father to come into the classroom, which to me is astonishing. I mean, I never invited my parents to watch me in court, and when I was a lawyer. And I think that it speaks to some level of real trust between the two of them. And I'm thinking to his discussion, very limited discussion, really, of how he came out to his parents. He barely mentions it in this book, but he describes a scene in which he tearfully came out, and they accepted him quickly. So I think it was pretty good all along. That's what I think. And had it not been pretty good even in the beginning, it couldn't have gotten so much better. That's what I think. The other thing I remember about this book was the reason he didn't go to the Bronx School of Science. He had a very good friend, and his friend didn't get into the Bronx School of Science, so he didn't go. And
Well, Nino at the end says that that's not the real reason. The real reason was he was afraid of failing.
well, that's later on, isn't it?
It's a reflection on Jay near the end of the book. That, I mean, this guy grew up with him evidently and recognized that he just, at least this was his position, that this guy, that Jay didn't go because of his friend, but actually that he didn't want to fail.
I thought that was about the PhD, that he didn't pursue the
I went to
PhD.
Bronx School of Science as well.
Also, both could be true.
I'm sorry?
I said both could be true.
Both could be true, sure. Yeah.
You know something else, Peggy?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that and it's so funny because reading it for me, it was all about the father looking for the son, not the son looking for the father. Because who decided to say, I would like to come to watch you teach? I mean, a big step. And it reminded me, just to bring a little personalization to it, when I was a professor at Notre Dame, I taught one summer a freshman seminar, and it was a required course. And in that course happened to be 6 senior citizen women and 6 freshman football players. So there were 12 students in this class of, this kind of relationship. It was the best course I ever taught, because every single thing that came up, all of a sudden, the kids were treating the women like their grandmothers. The grandmothers were talking to the kids, but there were no, and this is whoever just brought this up about walls, there was no distance necessary, because these were not actually their grandmothers, and these were not actually their grandsons. They just sort of spoke and got to know each other, which I think in this book, it's a very, very brave thing for a father to say to a son, I would like to get into your world and see what it is you do.
So you think that it's substantially the father looking for the son?
I do, because I think you get to the point, I don't know, I'm hopefully not too close, but when you start to think about, when I leave this world, have I done what I wanted to do? Do I know, and I don't even have children, but one would think, do I know my children as well as I should?
Although that upsets one of the premises of the book is that there's a parallel between Telemachus looking for Odysseus and Dan looking for Jade. Odysseus is not looking for, trying to discover Telemachus.
We don't know that he's not mentally. He may
Oh,
not
it's
be
both.
physically. We
It's
do
always
not know
both.
that there's not rumination and learning and anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, good. Adrian, and then Candy.
There are a lot of great things about the book, I think, but one of the best things for me was the way that the present-day story mirrors what happened in the Odyssey, just from the very structure of the whole story. Remember, he talks about ring composition. The story of the Odyssey is, here's what happens. This guy's in Troy, he goes through all these really interesting adventures, he yearns to get home, he gets home. That's the story. But that's not the way it's told. He starts the story, and then he goes back and talks about, well, Telemachus is there in Ithaca. And then he starts the story again. And then Odysseus is with these Phaeacians, and he tells them about Circe and the Cyclopses. He keeps looping back. Now, think of how this book is structured.
Right.
That's exactly the way it's structured. He tells them on the first 3 pages what's going to happen with the part that you read, right? Then he goes back and he says, this is what it was like when I was playing with my father when I was 5 years old, okay? And then he starts the story about the class. And then his father says, I don't think he's such a hero. What does the narrator do? He goes back and talks about how his father treated him as a kid and how he understands. So that's one thing. What you were just saying and what Roger said, it's another kind of mirroring, I think. So the story, Telemachus is learning about his father in the old story, right? So who does he go to? He doesn't ask his father what happened. He goes to Nestor, who tells him about something about his father. And then he goes to Menelaus, who tells him something about his father. What happens in this story? He goes to Uncle Howard to find out, what happened. He learns what happened, why he didn't go to the Bronx School of Science. And then he goes to Nino, and Nino tells him what happened when he was trying to get his PhD. So it's a beautiful type of mirroring. And so that's one thing. The other is he shows rather than tells. That's one example that I just gave you. Another example, I'm just going to read one thing. It's the point you made. When you're teaching, it's hard to know who's the teacher, right? He doesn't say that, though. He reads,
yourself is gonna major in classics, you
Right.
better be a
And she says, whenever I read the Odyssey, I'm going to think of
Your father.
her father.
Yeah, that's very touching.
That's a wonderful teaching moment, because as a teacher, I've taught for 41 years. The best thing a student can tell you is, whenever I think of X, I'll think of you.
Yeah,
But the teacher was not Dan.
that's
The
right,
teacher was
His father.
his father.
right.
That was humility on Dan's part too.
Yeah, one of the interesting things I think about this ring structure is, and I think it's made in the book, is that as you move from the present and you go back to the past and so on, it makes the past present. So that in a certain way, it's no longer about past, present, future. It's kind of like an eternal present. This is all happening in this, the complexity of the moment itself, which contains our experiences in the past. I think that's
And
great.
that's how modern writing is too.
I'm sorry?
Postmodern writing is like that too. And so many people complain about, oh, I hate this modern stuff. It should be like just a straight story. But it's been going on for a long time.
Right.
And I also wanted to say, I think that Dan is really reluctant telling us about himself. We know that he's gay, but we don't know a whole lot about whether or not he has a relationship now. We know there's a woman named Lily in his life that provided him with 2 sons, but that's all we know. And we know he has a good relationship with an instructor, 1 or 2 instructors in high school, but he's really reluctant to tell anything about his personal life. But I think something I liked about this, though, is this was not like a tell-all, like Mommy Dearest, where my father was so awful for me. He doesn't present himself as a victim, but it's more like an interaction of what happened between me and my father, who I am and who my father was.
Right.
And I actually think that that's partially because he is a father now as well. So he is, because his sons are little, but he's recognizing the fatherly parts of himself in his father.
And the complexities of being
Yeah.
a father. Right, right.
So really, it's showing many ways of being a father. The book is showing there's so many ways one can be a father.
I thought his stiltedness about discussing his own children sort of mirrored his father's behavior vis-a-vis the family.
We never talked about it, yeah.
When he was young, and the father seemed like he never praised the mother, he rarely kissed her. Well, I
At
can't
least that he
remember
saw.
how he treated his sons, but
So-
he was pretty remote, I think.
And critical, he was very critical.
Yeah.
I read two essays that he's written about, 2 very popular books that won awards, and he is a very critical critic. He's to the point of being kind of nasty and demeaning. So
Really?
I
Dan
thought that was
is-
Dan
Yeah,
Mendelsohn.
yeah, so, and he probably absorbed his father's credo that if it's not really difficult, it's not worth doing, especially given what you're saying.
But at the end of the book, when his father is dying, he's asking only for his wife.
But this
How's
is-
mother?
It's show, don't tell. That's why it's so good.
Yeah,
He doesn't say, I realize my father really loved my mother.
yeah.
He says,
Showed him.
every time he woke up, the first thing he said was, how's your mother? Is she okay?
And you know that great recognition scene, I wanted to read parts of it, that mirrors the Penelope of Odysseus recognition scene that Jay is narrating about his own understanding of himself and what it means that this idea of like-mindedness, which emerges as the key to a healthy relationship. And Homer is certainly showing that with Penelope and Odysseus, and he is showing it, isn't he, in the telling between himself and his wife, that he knows, and for all the difficulties and so on. It's another kind of recognition in which he becomes the teacher to the students about, you don't know anything about this yet. You're too young. But let me tell you what makes a healthy relationship, a healthy marriage. That, I think, is a very powerful part of this book.
Was his relationship with his wife healthy? Jay's relationship with his wife?
Well,
was
they
it-
certainly had a lot of problems. I mean, he
Yeah.
would sulk away after dinner, and she would wash the floor while
Crying.
crying.
Yeah, yeah.
Typical marriage, maybe. They stayed together, and whatever it was, it worked for them. It was
So-
good.
Yeah.
At one point, she says something like, "I'm not afraid of him dying, but I'm afraid of living without him," or something like that.
Yes,
Because
right.
that's the most horrible thing that she ever
Exactly.
encountered, is to be without Jay. So it wasn't all bad.
But doesn't it show, at least attempt to show, that below the surface, important surface of the vicissitudes of daily life, the bickering, the differences of opinion, the sulking, the silences, we don't know enough about Penelope and Odysseus to know if this is true, but we do know it about Jay and Marlene, I think is her name, that beneath all of this difficulty in the living together in a daily way is something very solid, this sort of like-mindedness, this sense of a similarity of values, of sensibility, and so on, which a very mature way of talking about things, isn't it? Because you can't control the interactions that go on in a daily kind of a way. But you can sense when there is this solid unanimity of some kind or another. And here it is, and he says so. You people, you students don't understand this yet.
Dan even mentioned at one point that their personalities complemented each other. She was bright, cheerful, colorful, outgoing, extroverted. He was introverted,
Yeah.
quiet, so that they were different, but that worked for them.
Right, right. And he talks about she's not as beautiful as she was, but still in all, there's something very deep in their relationship. Very, very mature understanding, way to understand it. Yeah. One of the things I loved about the book, this is obvious, but I'll say it anyway, is we learn a great deal about the Odyssey in this book, don't
Yeah,
we?
I never knew everything.
Yeah.
See all that.
The insights, I mean, tremendous insight. And what a way, in a way, Adrian, it's your point again. Rather than didactically going through the story, he uses that story as part of the drama of the classroom between his father. So along the way, you don't feel lectured to. You're coming into some understanding about it.
So, true confession, I was a classics major,
Oh, boy.
and we read the Odyssey. You know, when you read something in a foreign language, you're mainly focused on the language, right? I mean, you guys have taken Latin, French, whatever.
Not me.
I learned so much reading this about the Odyssey, because I always thought of the Odyssey, classics major, I always thought of the Odyssey as a series of adventures. It's exciting, right? The Cyclops, and yes, there's this faithful wife, yeah, that was good, and he wanted to get home, right? Okay. It's not about, well, it is about,
Oh, yeah.
but what it's also about is relationships. It's about sons and fathers, it's about husbands and wives. And that's what this book is about.
Yeah.
It's a story of, I taught this course, okay? We taught this course, my father was here. My father and I went on a cruise. That's the facts, right? But that's not what the book's about.
No, no. And it is great that he brings in the Tennyson Ulysses and the Gaddafi about the difficulties of getting home, maybe not getting home. So that adds even to the human quality of the entire thing. Jackie, did you have a comment?
No, Candy wanted to say
Oh,
something.
Candy.
Well, I'm not sure where to put this idea, but it kept popping up in my head. When I realized that this was, first of all that was in there about the Odyssey that I never knew about when I read the Odyssey, and it was one of my favorite books in high school, and I loved it. I loved all the adventures, but now I see how much more there was in there. And then I get to the point where I see that they're analyzing that the author is analyzing his father and his relationship, and he's transferring some of those ideas about being a father himself. And these are all intelligent, well-educated people, and they never talk about the influence of society on the values of the moral values and the way things should be, such as it's okay for dads to dry dishes, and it's okay for fathers to change diapers, and the roles that that the author creates were very 1950s, very fixed and rigid, and fathers are not like that today, or at least not acceptably like that today. They're considered really old-fashioned. And so, what about the role of society on parental roles? What is that effect? And he doesn't deal with it at all, I don't think. And because it's a classic, he kind of takes the whole subject and puts it in a glass case like it's not relevant, or...
Who's the he here?
The author.
The author.
He talks about parental roles as if they never change and they're not subject to cultural values.
Isn't there an implicit criticism of Jay as husband in the book? How he sulks away and locks himself in his room and...
Right, so is that because he's like that emotionally himself, or is it because it's not acceptable?
I was thinking
In
along the
society.
same line. It's when you were talking about the marriage, it's, well, of course, because that's how marriages were. These were people who lived through the Depression. This was the way they
Yeah,
accepted
but
each
it's-
other. You're right, he doesn't address it, but I don't think it's an implicit criticism of the father. I think it is the idea that this is the way these people interacted, and the journey is to move away from that, I think. It doesn't give Dan any credit for it. You're yearning for acknowledgement.
He doesn't
yeah.
acknowledge the effect that society has on our behaviors today
Right.
as fathers and sons.
Right, but to me,
And our relationships are, they are the same, but at the same time, they're different. Different things are expected of us today than...
But isn't it fair to respond, that's not what the book is about?
It is fair to respond that way.
It's trying to focus on the complexities and the depth of things that are complex in their own term. You bring in a kind of a social frame, and now you may be muddying the focus.
Yeah. Yes, that's very fair, and that's why I hesitated to bring it up, but yet it was a constant question in my mind as I was reading it. I would have liked for him to deal with that in some way, but it was an extremely interesting book.
By
Anyway.
not dealing with it, he's made it a little bit more timeless, I think.
Probably.
It's like, when you watch movies from a certain time and you go back and watch them again and you're like, well, that is so out of context for where we are now. This makes it, to me, feel a little classic that he doesn't.
What do you mean by class? What do you mean by that?
Well, if classic means we're paying attention, not to something deeper than society, because society is obviously something it's like when we do Torah study. I mean, the world in the Bible was very different from the world we live in, but that doesn't mean we can't extract relationship.
Well, I know what you mean. He's paying attention to natural phenomena
Not only natural.
and emotional
How about
phenomena.
perennial?
That doesn't change with society.
But you know what, I love that you brought that up. I didn't see that at all in the book, and now I'm seeing it. But that's an odyssey too, the odyssey from the mores of the 50s to current mores. It's not stated, but there it is.
But he talked about coming out, and he is the father of these kids.
Right.
So it's not made a big deal, but it's stated. I didn't feel personally that it missed that. I mean, it's a good point, but it's for some other book maybe. But he didn't make a big thing about that he has children and he's not married and he's gay, but he stated it, and that really didn't impact this conversation, this connection.
So what was that relationship with the father, the mother of his children? Did they live together?
I don't think so.
She's a New Jersey, I looked her up, and I think she's involved in the legal profession. She does something with, admits
He used
to
a real
loss.
name in here?
Yeah, there's a.
Oh, you looked it
I
up.
found her name, I think I looked him up, and that's how I.
And the
found
kids
her.
live with her. The kids live with her.
Kids live with her.
And
I
he
think
goes
it's
there
Trenton,
frequently, or
New
he?
Jersey, they live with her.
He talks about a number of places he lives. He's got his own
Yeah.
place, he's got a place with her, and then there's a house he grew up in Long
I
Island.
Oh, another
actually-
theme of
So
wandering.
apparently-
I actually
Wonder.
kind of respect him for not talking about that more, because
It would have sidetracked.
Yeah.
not only that, but, you know, there's a difference between
Your
talking
presence.
about an adult life and then talking about, you know, two small children who, you know, cannot say yes or no to, you know, do you mind if I write this about you?
And I think an
I think
author needs to know what story he's talking
Right,
about.
and that's not his story. He was
Yeah.
saying that's not,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
It's not
I
his
give him-
story.
Yeah, I give him a lot of credit for the parameters he set.
Yeah,
Which are wide.
Yeah.
Right,
But also-
and deep also,
but also
and it's very
specific,
fulfilling.
yeah.
But it's hard to ignore where we are today and to relate to what he's talking about without being involved in it.
I think it's still relevant, just from what I said before, the relationships and connections you have with your children and with your parents. And I think that is every time, from classical time to forever. And I think that's what it really is, because that's going to be something different from everyone. But again, I connect it with the fact that kids start looking at you differently as they get older. And sometimes it takes a third party to have them see that you have something special or something. You know, I just think it's not dated. This could be any time, even 50 years from now.
Right.
Well, maybe his father though was caught in time. I mean, this is sort of what Candy is saying. Well, fathers were not supposed to be touchy-feely, warm people, warm, loving fathers. They were supposed to be distant. They were supposed to be the breadwinners, and mom stayed at home and cooked. And so maybe if Jay and Daniel lived today, maybe Jay would have been a different father.
But I like to see it more as an internal matter rather than social norms. What does it mean when a person develops and faces some fears that a person had, faces a sense of self-awareness, and makes some choices, and those choices become fateful? He was worried about failing, and so he made some choices that resonated, that had impact on his life and how he related to others. I see it less in terms of social norms than the psychological development of an individual facing particular crossroads in life. You know, where do I go to college? Who do I marry? How many kids do I have? These are all choices that have implications for how I see myself and also in relationship with others. So I think I see it as a psychological drama.
I think that was Daniel's intent then. I agree.
Well, they talk explicitly about how personal growth is, well, it's one of the themes of the book. Remember when they were talking about something in class, I can't remember what it was, but the father said, I know a thing or two about that. I think it was when they were talking about relationships between the husband and wife.
And also when Dan was coming out. His father said, let me talk to him, I know
a
something
thing or
about
two.
it.
Well, see, I looked at that and I thought, how does he know a thing or two about that?
Yeah.
Why? And then I thought about the relationship with a special friend in high school.
Right.
And there was there was a hint that the father had some experiences, but interestingly, that was completely undeveloped.
Right.
But it kind of threw off his life, I think,
Mhm.
this special feeling he had for this friend.
Right.
It's like a little hint, and he doesn't really go into it, so you have to draw conclusions for yourself.
Yeah.
Some things we just never really know.
But also that the father was willing to expose himself at that moment. I know something about it, which you didn't expect. He
Right.
seemed to be very tight and closed and self-protective. So that was also kind of a recognition moment.
Not what you would expect, not the traditional my son's gay kind of
Right.
Right.
But it would kind of explain the father's, why do I keep forgetting the father's name? Jay's,
Jay.
Jay's kind of coldness in his own marriage.
Right. Exactly.
Letting his wife cry in the kitchen. I mean, he might have been upstairs crying, paying the bills. And maybe there was some way that they just couldn't meet, and until they were both near the end.
In terms of the narrative logic, let's forget the good rightness or wrongness of the behavior. It kind of sets us up for a transformation. When you see him as not caring about his wife going off and being very cold-hearted, it sets us up for the moment in which he comes to recognize what is deep and durable in that relationship. And she too. I can't get along without you, and so on. Okay.
Beautiful book.
I just have, if we're finishing, little teeny tiny things that I wanted to, I can't resist talking about. You're talking about how the book loops around, and the father was called Daddy Loopy.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
then the bed, I mean, what a wonderful
Yeah.
detail.
Ah.
And then Penelope in the
Right.
bed, so that was like awesome.
And the book ends with door. The
Door, the bed is a door,
Yeah.
and that's just amazing.
It's like the
Did
sled.
everybody get that? Did everybody get that? Because it's not obvious.
The door to
Did
the
you
bed.
get it? The father is out of it.
Yeah.
They think the father's mind is gone. And the father wakes up and the nurse cranks up his bed. And Daniel is there.
Yeah.
And the father pats the bed. Door, he
Yeah.
says.
Yeah.
Door. And Daniel looks at his sister-in-law and says, he's out, he's gone. Then Daniel goes home.
And he
Yeah.
And
realizes
he sees the bed that his
Right.
father has been sleeping on when he visited him, which his father made out of the door.
Out of the door. Oh,
That's
sure.
right, his father
It's
made
easy
out
to
of the
miss.
door.
And on which he slept.
Yeah, he knew what he was talking
Right.
about.
But what
It's-
was the father trying to say?
He was trying to tell Daniel,
I remember.
remember about Penelope
Yeah.
and the bed.
Mhm.
She tested Odysseus. He knew that the bed couldn't be moved because they were the only two people that knew that the bed was made from a tree.
Right.
They were the only two people that knew that.
Yeah.
That's how she recognized him.
Right. So why was the father saying door, talking about Penelope?
He was telling Daniel, this is our secret.
Mhm.
Oh.
Yeah.
The
Right.
bed has a door. Nobody else knows about this.
Yeah. It's very similar to the sled. And what's that
Yes. Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Randolph Hearst?
Citizen Kane.
Oh,
What was that?
yeah.
What's that?
Rosebud,
movie?
Rosebud.
What's
Citizen
that?
Kane.
Citizen Kane, right?
Yeah, the sled at the end.
Yes. Oh my God, how did you remember
Yeah,
that?
no, I thought that was a brilliant, brilliant move. And I love the point that Penelope is as wily as he is. She was having her adventure in the palace while he was having the adventure. And so that has something also to do with like-mindedness. They're both crafty, they're both capable of devising a ruse and having these adventures and surviving them. So it's another way of showing, rather than telling. You can see how they're made for each other. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank
It's such a
you.
wonderful book, isn't it?
Wonderful.
Thanks, Jane, for organizing.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for everybody for coming. if anyone needs a copy of The Escape Artist, I have two to be
I
checked
would like
out.
a copy. And I have 2 books to give back to you. We could talk about this book for hours, there's so much
I
in
know.
it.
I think I want to take one also.
Okay.
I was glad you mentioned the paragraph. The paragraph long sentences, because if, it's in the very beginning, it took me about 2 weeks to get through those 20 pages. I'm gonna, oh, it wasn't. And then I kind of got into it, and I liked it. Yes, oh, great, yes. Or, it's because he was talking about the Odyssey and classics, as opposed to the sections that he related the narrative between, things in his life. When he, at one point, it was hard, and I didn't remember all that much about the Odyssey.
Doesn't matter.
But it was interesting, and I'm sure my freshman high school teacher didn't include all the deep stuff, because I'm sure my freshman high school teacher who taught the Odyssey to me didn't include all of it. She don't get into the book in the same way we did, for sure.
It's not an easy book.
No, but I loved it. I don't know why, but
I read the Iliad as an adult.
I never read the Iliad.
Well,
But I read the Odyssey, and I often thought about going back and reading it again.
Janet Petullo runs a course. Well, she runs a course for both, Iliad and Iliad. Maybe I'll take the Odyssey course, when she gives it again.
I mean, I should at least go back and read it again. I liked it so much. I think the other was book.
Yeah.
There's never enough time,
No, there isn't.
and there's always too many books to read.
Yeah, and I'm a slow reader too.
Yeah, that's my problem.
Candy?
I know, of course, right. Thank you.
And if you were lonely,
I'm trying to get everybody.
I can't believe all those petitions are going around. He's really good for this.
yeah.
You mean have a place they will I think so, I think she's just decided she wants to
Be surprised. You'd be surprised.
Adrian, it's nice to see you.
You sign my petition?
Object.
No, but here's the thing,
That's why I checked this one, but I couldn't go outside.
First act.
yes, they do, then all the congressmen write emails calling them. It's just, it's not your fault, but they're going
In my neighborhood.
Yeah, right. Where,
Solely. I live
in Solon.
Yeah,
I tell them.
Yeah, but the last time, in Lake County, there's
I was gonna make a comment about your comment. All of us are
Well,
polyphonic.
no, it's basically the stage, and the overall stage. You do at the very beginning.
So, I mean,
Not to require.
one role is being a wife, one role is being a mother.
That's a big one.
issues of the social norms, the moral fabric that we learn.
They go behind.
It's just a way to
So
everybody grow and develop and.
interviews reacting to
The conductor, or the composer, the intermission.
Right, I do respect the boundaries that the author put on it, and I don't think he considered it one to go to. And I do think he's doing something more natural in terms of relationships. And respect as we part is that
Yeah.
Fourth, but
I mean, like the
so
father
it's,
who
it's
was
Wednesdays.
grumpy and silent and
Jane,
and all that. The interesting part is that
and it starts at 6:30.
It's
no
personal.
matter
What
what
I
old
did
they were,
was dinner, and if you wanted to join the dinner, she got something to do.
not to do it, but
Because I'm not very, I know you, I'll tell you where it is.
they do, and that gives me good hope. I know that I don't feel the same towards my parents as I did 30 years ago. And no, they're not, but
Okay.
my feelings haven't changed.
Actually, tapping out or.
And that I don't have regrets or that I don't wish I was the older I get, and especially the more I realize my children. It's not always your my parents have made, and so they continually, I continually bite my tongue. Right, you wanna know the one thing about being a grandma? Bite your tongue. And, never got it, maybe it was your own love, and you couldn't deal with my husband and what you expected of me, and so I was like, distanced myself, and that was, I never wanted to, she was such a hurtful woman, to deal with her, and I regret that.
My mother's like,
Really independent. I mean, we had our 6-year-old would go to the grocery store.
That was my role in life, for my kids to be independent.
Right.
Take the bus instead of having to come to me all the time. Right.
So that son gets married,
Okay.
and they have kids. It's the most overly protective parents you ever saw. I could bite your tongue, I could have killed them.
They holler, they holler, I know, I see that now
One of
too.
the composers, knowledge can be like.
Why can't they see what we saw when
Right.
they were glued? Why is that such a mystery to my mother?
well, the times are different now.
It's because the times are different.
And people are running around with guns. I mean,
Thank you, Jackie.
no idea.
They don't let them out,
Daycare.
they don't let them outside the house.
So people over the line is the area. Very care about.
And that's why, did you read the paper?
This was got shot because she was playing kickball or something, and the ball went into the neighbor's yard. She would pick up the ball and was swinging, and he shot her in the back. It never criticized about this. So maybe not at our age, but it's also interesting.
We like to think it's.
But I will say, I love having a daughter-in-law and a son-in-law because they're so much nicer than my own children.
You're right. Well, that's not true for my son-in-law, but it is definitely true for my daughter.
Definitely.
She is a sweetheart,
Oh, my
and
God.
she brings out the best. She's not afraid to give me something kicking ass when he needs it. And she's the only one who But unfortunately, I work the opposite. My son-in-law doesn't even realize.
My brother's book.
They're just, yeah.
She was on some island in Greece.
Interesting.
So, but she had, her father was her mother, he did a wonderful job, and
She's grateful.
she had stepsisters and a stepmother, and, but she never really had a mother, so. She doesn't mind what.
I don't know anything to do, I don't know how to contact
Me,
him, I don't
I am
know how to do this.
and Christine.
And so I had,
Along with her. She's like,
it's interesting, it never, I never reached
her mother is every minute. She's hard, she's the baby, and why doesn't the baby have soccer? She
Yeah, it comes
much
from
more
critical
fabulous
than she is.
opportunity, you know?
I'm aware of any of those things, and so I understand this. I'm a pretty positive person.
He
Is
says
it because of the drugs that you're taking, or?
Well, actually, yesterday,
Oh, my goodness.
he had
And
a very big
Yeah,
mistake.
right.
but there's not, yeah, I mean,
And
obviously you
a
can't,
dose in it,
but it
and,
never occurred to me until that
CMA?
yeah, the shooters that.
Yeah, we went last 2 weeks ago.
So I'm really so it's
If
my
I
feet
I did
for an hour and a half.
As a result of.
I was sad that,
It's something separate. And,
Oh, it's separate, so what, they look at it, treat it separately instead of looking at it?
well, whatever causes it, there are certain treatments available. The drugs do make me tired. So yesterday, but yesterday had a great day.
so I've no
And,
access to
but
everybody's doing it.
And, everybody's very tired.
There's a new Broadway show called,
Sometimes when I do too much, I don't sleep well,
Yeah.
when I really should.
there's something about like Cops of Corn, and it's similar, it's
Okay, so I had surgery,
this one kind of.
my radiation treatments.
The first, there's a Chicago.
Well, maybe what you're talking about hair.
And orange.
Yeah, that's where I am.
Yeah,
Yeah, very good.
I heard
Good,
that.
I really liked.
What is it on Netflix or HBO?
The doctors who I was with.
You don't remember me? You should make it just an evening. Oh my God, that would be so fun. That would be so fun. All right.
That's fine.
Yeah,
I used to take Xarelto, and
really lovely people there. I mean, when Dorothy.
it doesn't need to spend a lot of time. So Xarelto, it's a blood thinner. I used to take Coumadin, but
Did you know Belfier, the Jewish?
A month. And the insurance company covered. And,
oh my gosh.
and it was this drug that
I
drove
do remember your name.
killed all my neutrophils. I went into,
All your neutrophils?
you know, the white blood cells.
And then I was on carrying.
So they had to go, I mean, it could have
John
done
runs
me.
the MSA program at Case.
And so now I'm off of it, I have full credit.
Because he knew Kathy.
And I'm wondering, what should I do? Because I'm certainly never gonna take it.
Right,
Yeah.
I know,
Meanwhile,
I know.
lots of-
That's
And
how
do you use the pool at all?
Claudia and I got to talking.
Yeah.
But I take this.
And how,
I used to take Coumadin, which was a lot more difficult to get.
because it's
Because
interesting.
it's because I had a blood clot 10 years later. And so it means I have antiphospholipid syndrome, which means that there's a quality of blood that makes it sticky
I'm not,
and
yeah.
easy to.
Well, when I'm waiting for a while, because it's a con,
And the Coumadin
it's not being
had to be monitored.
financially.
To go to school, right?
You have to go and get your blood drawn, and then you have to have a doctor
But I
look
have
at the results of the INR.
suspicion, having been through initial sequence in Manhattan,
There are qualities of the
that
blood
at
that
some point,
has to be within a certain range,
or
or you'll bleed to death,
so I want to stay there.
the opposite will happen, and it'll get sticky and they get a blood clot.
At
So it has to
some
be within a
point,
range.
maybe I'll-
And so I had to go and have it monitored every, I took the pill,
You are
and every month I would have to go and get a blood test, but if the blood test was bad, I would
Well, doing a, Kathy runs a,
And so, I mean, it was subject to how many leafy green vegetables you ate, like broccoli and spinach. Well, you can eat all of it, but in moderation. And I never figured out how it affected or was adversely affected in my diet. Because it's very difficult to eat the same amount of
I still go out to the
stuff
lake sometimes
on a regular
because,
basis.
you know,
Like swimming.
smaller
Yeah.
parts.
I mean, sometimes you have
And
3
when I
servings
had
of broccoli in a week,
bigger
and you won't have it
part,
again for a week or two.
she said,
You know what I mean?
here,
So,
We have it every day, it's a bad thing.
so I
nice.
still sort of have.
no, I think it's a good thing, but if you're also doing spinach with it,
Oh,
I can never figure out
But she did it,
the ratio, and I was on cumin and
and
so I just went, I just ate what I wanted, just went.
because
So it was vitamin K, and so, I think I did it again, and I said,
Roger,
but cumin was
his
$17
doctor
for
said,
3 months, or $12 for 3 months, something like that. And Xarelto
apparently it
is,
makes it less.
$1,000 for 3 months.
Your insurance covering?
Yes, it covers all but, covers
that's
all
right.
but. I paid $350 in January, and then $75 and $75 for a 3-month period. So I paid $500 a year, and the insurance company pays the rest, and thousands, and I don't know. I don't know.
What are you doing now when you retire?
So,
One of the things I do,
I'm not sure.
I told myself it used to be 10 pounds.
Eloquist is the same thing as Xarelto. It's just, I know cumin and Xarelto are different, are treating the same thing.
Like seem to be
Eloquist, are they, is it
bounce back.
rivaroxaban?
No, it's apivax-aban, so it's not.
So I don't know if it's the same or not. But
It
it's
is the same way.
the same thing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that's.
And your kids are good, your grandkids are great, and
My
my
insurance covered.
But, oh, yeah, I have really good insurance so far.
But my son
Well, I have state teachers retired.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I've had that too for my freshman year.
Exactly. It just kept growing.
So
There are some people in the retired state teachers at medical plan, they have a special phone number and an answer that you can call for problems to pay for. So I haven't,
I mean, it's an angsty time.
so I went to get
Kevin was running them up, and all of us
prepared for
put her over the edge.
spiraling for the radiation, but I haven't had,
But she's
and I only have to have 5
funny,
doses.
smart, you know, she's even wonderful, she drives
But all in 1 week,
Yeah.
and it starts on the 23rd.
I still
2 weeks from
tattoo that
yesterday.
he gave me right
Yep.
here.
Your author
Yeah,
son.
right here.
Months.
They're funny,
Yeah, no, I read them when he
That's
was
right,
very
that's
I'm
right.
down, I'm down here.
And he sees your incision, is it good?
Oh, no, I didn't go back to me. I just considered that part of it. I didn't have any pain. I had very little discomfort, so I was just fine. I had more trouble with being constipated from that.
And where are they living? Somewhere near you?
So,
So I was
so
slammed.
that
Treat
treatment
me
is,
easy.
it's hard.
That really helps with constipation. I don't know if you're on
Really good question.
aspartame.
Good for them.
I took milk with it.
Oh, Natalie's on forever. So sometimes when it's.
And then it was awful. Yes,
Leo with me.
because it was exploded inside of me. They were so violent. And
No, Bremer didn't know what
in any case, I'm over it. And I'm back to my normal self. And so it's just, I don't think I'm going to start the radiation. Dr. Lyons.
Are you guys seeing soon?
Did you know her?
She was on it too.
Oh, I was
She,
gonna
when I
say,
just did the store study on Saturday morning,
so
I always
kind.
saw her.
And she said, was to say, well,
Yeah, isn't that cute? I know, yeah, they still
I
know.
explained all my schedule. She was great. So But then after that's over, I went to a
Yes, that's big.
He's amazing.
couldn't
No,
find
and that's
anybody
been for years, he doesn't remember.
before, I don't know, May 25th, this was a month ago. And so I took an appointment with somebody down at UHA.
You're the UH system.
Oh, yeah.
And,
He's really doing fine.
and he told me that he's going to put me on
And you guys are,
an
it's
Aspen
watching
something like a goal.
It really is. I don't know how long it'll
An
last, but.
asshole, an
You
asshole.
know,
Oh, yeah.
but it's
He's
good.
married to
A-N-Y-A-T.
Tanya F.
No.
is there a,
There's a word, he doesn't go there, he doesn't feel.
Tamoxifen is the usual one because of blood clots, I can't take
But I
it.
couldn't take
Incorporates the
it.
exercise that he needs to go run my daughter's. It's just.
Well, that's the problem.
it's adorable, everybody cares.
The side effects are not very
It's
good.
just.
That's what,
It's like me, when I walk Leo every time.
I mean, I sweated bullets.
I do like 50 contractions, thinking that maybe will keep my stomach flat.
So I just.
Well, and it's, to me, that kind of doing this, it's kind of like a sit-up.
Good.
It's a lot.
Thank you.
Couple of body breath and, you know.
But he said I don't.
Yeah.
So that's on stuff.
Just two girls catching up over here.
Mostly talking about you.
Well,
Yeah.
my ears aren't ringing at all, so it must not be good.
Take your
She's
medication.
telling me how adorable she
I
thinks
don't
Jay
even
is.
have
The
medication.
best thing about him is that
9
he's
years
not
ago.
afraid to take help from her.
9 years old.
Yes.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
So I'm
that's
just,
strange.
So I'm not on any medication.
I'm just putting it out there.
Cancer?
But that could make you love
Did
it.
it
It
return?
puts, you put it out here and there it goes.
And so everything that you're taking now is preventative.
Supersede.
How's Jay doing?
He's great, I was telling Jackie, he's real diligent, does his exercises, he's just doing
It's gone right
fine.
now,
We made a lot
so-
of friends over there.
In remission or?
Yeah.
Everything's good.
And
It's never,
you guys
It's not
settling in there?
Very settled.
but it's
Feels
controlled
like, don't
drugs,
go
but
right
right
away.
now,
I was telling Jackie she should come swim, you know, we have a pool.
that's the drug that costs $13,000 a month.
I see.
And
I'm a floater.
So do they think that the cancer will return or?
Well, this is
they
a lovely
probably
group,
will,
I enjoyed it.
because
I
they
love
couldn't
this
take
book
the full
so
course.
Yeah.
much.
It's not
It's so
Then
moving.
class-
It's so moving,
Oh,
so
I mean, I could
beautifully
have gone
written.
back on.
so beautifully written.
Did they give you percentages?
Right,
Yeah.
and it works on so many
Yes.
levels, doesn't it?
Yes, yes,
They
yes.
Adrian is
So I'm just not thinking about it.
He really is.
So I can exercise as much
Yes,
as
he
I
is.
can.
Oh, he's so spontaneous.
That's what I'm
You know,
doing.
poetry
And deal with
things.
quality of
Yeah,
life
very,
issues, but I
very.
do have
This is about 6. She's
Yeah.
having an orgasm.
Right.
It's the cutest. I mean,
So
it's
that's
right.
exactly where I'm at.
And I'm following you guys.
I just
Still,
keep my appointments.
I haven't much, but I love to get the
And
emails
if it's
and know what you're reading.
uncomfortable,
Good, good,
I'll
good.
quit it, that's all.
You do that too.
The drug.
What we're
Yeah.
reading, just
You know,
see what we're
But
reading.
I'm not there yet, I have to wait till the radiation.
How are Russell and
Well, I
Nancy?
took a drug.
They seem good. They seem
They
good.
come to us.
Oh, they have been coming. Good.
When I took oxygen, they were, and I was able to get by.
Yeah, good.
Good.
All
All
right.
right, so I'll be over at 5:30.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye, nice to
Take
see
care.
you.
Thank you, Roger, that was
Thank you.
great.
You know,
This was good. Yeah. He was,
They did a great job. That one was said, my parents have never come to see me practice law. I said, you should what? When you get settled, you should say,
Go out and do it.
is there a court date? Can I come and watch you work? Or
That's
ask,
nice.
or ask Alyssa if you could watch her. You know, I mean, just to, even if they say no,
you've asked.
you've asked and you've shown that you're interested in what they do.
Why don't you ask?
No, I just thought, you know, it's interesting because I dragged my parents all the way to Europe to see me in a show. You know, because, and I don't know that they would have ever asked to do that. Now, being in a show is a little different because
Yeah,
the
yeah,
purpose of it is for people to come and see it.
yeah.
But, you know, I thought that's a really interesting idea that parents could be that curious in their
I think
children.
it's a nice thought.
Makes me feel bad because we never went to watch Josh teach, and he always said, we come, we never did because we were too lazy.
Well, it's not too late.
You know, you're right.
You can say, you know, remember when you asked us to come, we're gonna take you up on it.
No, that's a good thought, though, actually. All right, you're coming at 5:30.
I will, I'll just text, I'll call
say hi to Jay for
Oh, I
us?
sure will, thank you.
How are you doing?
Well, thank you, yeah. By the time Jackie, our pool's gonna open soon, so I'll be doing even better, yeah.
Now, did your parents live in that building?
They did.
So that building was familiar
It
to
was
you?
home, I spent a lot of time at the pool with our kids when our kids were little. Yeah.
That's so interesting, I didn't realize.
Yeah, for many years.
Well, that's
Got in, so